Dear colleagues, I welcome you all. The COVID-19 pandemic and our government's reactions have raised a number of issues that fall obviously within the competence of the Council of Europe and our Assembly Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, which I chair. Whilst waiting for a clarification of our rules permitting full-scale online committee meetings, I have taken the initiative, together with the chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, Vladimir Vardanyan, to hold this informal consultation with leading representatives of relevant Council of Europe bodies, which, as I must stress, is not a committee meeting. Let me first give the floor to our Secretary General, Mr. Wojciech Sawicki, for a view. Welcome into us. Wojciech, please, the floor is yours.
So, Boriss, Chairperson, well, both dear Chairpersons, Commissioner, Mr. Alivizatos, I'm very pleased to welcome you, this afternoon in this, virtual meeting room, where you will discuss important legal and human rights aspects of the COVID pandemic, and which is probably more important, our member states' reaction to it. And our institution, the Council of Europe, has an important role to play in upholding our rights and freedoms, and who knows, especially in times of crisis, which we are confronted with at the moment. And our Assembly, whose members have a double mandate, as we all know, national one, but also European one, I hope, will not fail to raise also its voice in this respect. And such an exchange as that one which we are going to hold now during this afternoon, which brings together Commissioner for Human Rights, leading representatives of the Venice Commission, Committee Against Torture, the Convention 108 on data protection, and the European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice, will certainly provide both our chairpersons present here of the Legal Affairs Committee and of its Subcommittee on Human Rights, and I hope through them, whole Assembly with valuable input for our work under preparation on the COVID crisis. So again, I would like to thank very warmly both chairpersons for the initiative to hold this hearing and wish all of you, the best of success for this afternoon. And let's have a good seminar now. Thank you.
Thank you, Wojciech, for your kind words and good advice, as always. And please let me now welcome our distinguished experts, also on behalf of Mr. Vardanyan. So Mrs. Dunja Mijatović, Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, and Mr. Alivizatos, member of the Venice Commission for Greece, and the Venice Commission's rapporteur on states of emergency and derogations from the European Convention on Human Rights. And in the second part of our meeting, 3 more experts will join. Mr. Gnatovsky, President of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, CPT, Mrs. Perucci, Chair of the Consultative Committee on Convention 108 on Data Protection, and Mr. Stav, Austrian member and former Chair of the European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice, CEPEJ. Our event will be held in 2 parts. The first until approximately 2:45, with Ms Mijatović and Mr. Alivizatos, and the second from 4 p.m. until 4:45 with Mr. Gnatovsky, Mr. Perucci, and Mr. Stav. The format of the consultation will be one of a dialogue between each expert and Mr. Vardanyan or myself. We will ask the experts some questions, and both sessions will be recorded and subsequently translated into French. The recordings will be uploaded on the Assembly's YouTube channel, and all our committee members will be sent links and invited to comment. And now let us begin. Mrs. Mijatović, thank you again for agreeing to join us for this discussion. Mrs. Mijatović, you have been very busy over the past few weeks. You have made many important contributions to the public debate, and these have been widely reported in the international media. We'll certainly add the link to your statements in the description of this video. We believe that parliamentarians must support these efforts, and this is the main goal of our today's consultations and probably forthcoming report. So my first question is the following. Many countries have now been under so-called lockdown for over a month. Such extreme restrictions have been never applied to so many people for so long. Do you think that this is a problem from a human rights point of view?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to see you all in good shape and healthy. And also very happy to have this opportunity to exchange views with colleagues, even though it is in cyberspace. But we use this opportunity again to talk about the importance of human rights. I'm grateful for your engagement, your support, and I will try to be very brief in my replies to your questions. I'm very honored to see that my statements are followed, and this is something that many MPs, but also other parts of Council of Europe are taking into account, because we are trying really to touch upon the most marginalized groups of people. And what we see is that European governments are fighting against the spread of the pandemic with strong measures, which is something that I think is of great importance. This is necessary in order to respond to the unprecedented challenge that we are all facing. At the same time, it is also clear that the enjoyment of human rights is affected in this period, and that is why my team and I are constantly trying to monitor everything that is happening in member states. But it is therefore crucial that the authorities take measures that are not leading to discrimination and proportionate to the aims pursued. Access to healthcare, of course, for all population groups is based on sound medical evidence, is clearly the priority. What we also have to say is that states should really make sure and assess very carefully which measures are strictly necessary, but should also ensure transparency in the process. I'm very much aware, as a Commissioner for Human Rights, that we live in a very difficult period, but at the same time, I think the governments that are in place now during this unprecedented period will also show their level of responsibility and how much they really believe in democracy and human rights.
Boriss, please turn on the mic.
So sorry, now must be fine. Thank you. Mrs. Mijatović, in your first public statement on 16th of March, you called for solidarity and unity between public authorities and citizens in response to the pandemic. Do you think that this has been achieved? In other words, have Council of Europe member states responded in a democratic way? Are there any situations that have given you cause for concern?
Well, this is, I would say, a mixed picture, to be very honest with you. During the process of monitoring and following in relation to the measures taken by the states, I noticed, of course, several states really moving not in a good direction, to put it this way. Certain states really responded in a democratic way by ensuring a rapid flow of information to the public and providing also access to healthcare. It is encouraging as well to see that there is a debate in many national contexts on the proportionality and the necessity of certain measures. and the introduction of contact tracing technologies is a good example, I would say. This shows also that member states are more and more recognizing that their response to the crisis must be framed in their human rights obligations. However, we've seen, and you probably noted several of my statements targeting particular states and particular measures, and I would say that this situation is quite worrying, and that some measures that are introduced under the pretext of fighting against COVID-19. And my answer to this is very simple. Even in an emergency, it is necessary to ensure parliamentary and judicial scrutiny, and I hope that you will agree with me on this. And of course, the right to freedom of expression and access to information. It is a challenge, but at the same time, this is the way it should be.
Thank you. You just mentioned vulnerable groups, and in your public statements, you have rightly focused on the situation of these groups, like older persons, persons with disabilities, Roma and travelers, migrants at sea, prisoners or immigration detainees. How could suffering of the people in these groups have been avoided?
This is also, this unprecedented time is also giving not just the governments, but to all of us a possibility to really look at lessons learned. And if we look at the marginalized and vulnerable groups that you just mentioned, groups of our society that are targeted for many reasons and they are living in a quite difficult circumstances, now during this unprecedented situation, it is showing that if certain things were tackled before, if certain issues were taken care by the governments before, we would not be facing this grave situation when it comes to the status of affairs, when it comes to vulnerable groups during COVID-19. Some of the suffering, in my view, could be avoided if member states had invested in protecting the rights of people concerned well before crisis began. So how we are dealing with this at the moment, it's a quite worrying picture, I must say. And this is why my work, I think, the work of PACE and the work of different monitoring bodies that we have at the Council of Europe and the institution of the Council of Europe is for. So I think the states should really use the tools they have and do something in order to avoid this kind of situations.
Thank you. And my next question about a sensitive issue which must be of particular interest to you, I believe. So there has been a flood of information, misinformation and disinformation about the disease, the situation in different countries and the measures taken by national authorities. On the one hand, accurate information is vitally important. But on the other, they can legitimately have different or critical point of view. So people can have different views. How far can the authorities go to prevent dangerous misinformation without violating freedom of expression?
This is quite an issue that was on the agenda even before COVID-19 for different reasons, not to go into details right now. The best way to counter disinformation is to respond with correct and reliable information that should be available and accessible to media and to the public. How do we make sure that citizens can really access the information that is reliable and truthful is a big question. But here I go back to something that PACE is also quite famous for: support of public service broadcasting, support of genuine effective, independent public service broadcasting that is talking to the citizens, talking to people in member states. Many states didn't do enough in order to support this public service broadcasting, and now we see this as a boomerang coming back. I agree there is a lot of conspiracy theories, there are a lot of information circling around not helping governments at the first place in order to fight corona. Different views are something that I would always support. Disagreeing is also something that I would also always support, but spreading false information during this very worrying situation is quite problematic, and it is dangerous for a democratic, for any society. So effective measures to protect people's health and lives also include combating disinformation that may cause panic, it may cause social unrest, and this is something that we need to be very careful about. However, to respect freedom of expression, any measures to combat disinformation should be necessary, of course, proportionate, and subject to regular oversight. Parliaments, I think they should play a very important role. National human rights institutions in the Council of Europe member states, and they must never prevent journalists from carrying out their work, which was unfortunately the case in too many Council of Europe member states, which was also very visible in my statements in relation to media freedom and safety of journalists. So we need, like in many other issues that we are tackling, we need to strike the right balance. How to do this is a big question mark. But at the same time, on one side, we have to fight disinformation, but we should not prevent information moving in the direction of public, reliable, truthful information. And who should give those information is a big question, and how much people trust certain media outlets. And again, I go back to public service broadcasting, that I think is also one lesson learned, that the states need to do more in order to support independent public media.
Micro, Boris. Micro.
Oh, sorry. Again, I still keep muting myself. Yes, thank you for this answer. It's really one of the central issues. So justified restrictions for the freedom of expression is one of the major challenges for all governments affected by this pandemic. And my last question is, what do you think will be the legacy of the crisis in terms of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law? What are your hopes and fears for the future? We often hear that the law will never be again as it was before the crisis, but in your view, will it be better or worse?
Well, my hope for the future is that we do not go back to the status quo, at least. Unfortunately, that is probably the main risk, that we go through yet another global crisis without learning, which would be something of a great disappointment if it happens. Only last Thursday, I published a human rights comment entitled "Learning from the Pandemic to Better Fulfill the Right to Health." In it, I stress the way ahead is a combination of universal health coverage and social protection measures. We need to tackle poverty more than ever before and strengthen the right of housing. And social rights in general, I think, will come back to us in the most problematic, but also in the way to give the states, civil society, and each and every citizen more reason to really pay attention to those rights. States should also ensure the positive measures taken as a matter of emergency to protect human rights, access to shelter to homeless people. Here I'm again talking about issues that were not tackled in a proper way in many member states, even in the very rich member states of the Council of Europe. Women's shelters, than also many other vulnerable groups that we mentioned also during this conversation. Of course, there is also, I would say, a risk that this crisis will take us to a worse place, as you said. All emergency measures and powers that the current situation does not warrant should be immediately reversed. And those which are temporarily necessary but restricts freedom must be rolled back. And this is something that is important. Also, the emergency measures that are immediately looked at and taken care of are not extended until we do not know a deadline. And then during this time, we will all suffer. Democracies will suffer, and this is not something that any of us would like to see. It must be a priority, I would say, to ensure that this is done in a very swift and transparent way. We will, of course, continue to monitor and address these issues when the time comes. And before that, I just wish a lot of strength and health to all members of PACE and also Secretariat and Secretary General. And I do hope we will have the opportunity to talk soon again. There is a lot planning for my office in the near future. And as you stated at the beginning, you are following it, so I hope you will also see certain issues that are of importance for human rights also in this very difficult time.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner, for your contribution. I am sure we will stay in touch, and I am sure that we will do our best to support your efforts, and our cooperation will be fruitful. So take care, and let's make our world, indeed, let's do our best to prevent our world becoming the worst place, as you said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Mr. Vardanyan. Vladimir, please.
Hi, everybody. Let me also, on my behalf, express the words of gratitude to Commissioner for the very valuable contribution to this issue. I would like just not to waste the time, and I would like just address my questions to Mr. Nicos Alivizatos, the members of the Venice Commission. And can you hear me? Okay, Kalimera.
Yes,
Kalimera, yes. I would like just to ask the following question, since we face very interesting contribution of the Venice Commission, Mr. Alivizatos. Just a couple of days ago, the Venice Commission has published a compilation of its past works on the states of emergency. The present situation with the coronavirus pandemic is unprecedented, as you know. However, why is the work done by the Venice Commission in the past still relevant? What's your opinion?
Look, although it relates to specific countries, among others, France, Turkey, and Armenia, if I may say, there are some general principles which are being underlined in the various opinions issued by the Venice Commission, which may be proved very relevant and useful in planning, on how to cope with the coronavirus. Which are those, if I may enumerate a few of them, of those general principles? First of all, let us try to avoid de facto situations and be proactive. That is to say, provide for the measures to be taken whenever such an emergency occurs in time. Preferably in the Constitution itself, but not necessarily. Second, let us try to have in mind that emergency does not mean derogation of the rule of law. The rule of law is there, but there are some restrictions also provided by the law. I happen to be French educated, and I remember that in the 19th century, the French were using an expression, dictature prévue, for the état de siège. So, of course, we are not talking about dictatorships. We are talking about some specific situations provided, though, from before. Third, basic principles. There might be various degrees of emergencies, from normalcy to state of war. Various degrees, and I would say that it is useful to provide for those various degrees. Fourth, narrow interpretation of the derogations to human rights. And fifth, I would say, it has also been mentioned by Madam Commissioner, let us not introduce permanent changes to the legal systems during the emergencies. Only short-term measures under the principle of temporariness. It is not written black on white in the European Convention in Article 15, but apart from the principles of necessity and proportionality, which are extremely important, the principle of temporariness to provide for short delays in the measures that are introduced to cope with those situations is extremely important. So I enumerated some of those basic principles which are repeatedly underlined in the various opinions issued by the Venice Commission, which might be useful.
So thank you so much. But legally speaking, different states have responded to the pandemic in different ways. Some have introduced special measures without declaring state of emergency. Most have declared the state of emergency as the basis for the emergency measures. And a considerable number have also derogated from the obligation under the European Convention of Human Rights. Could you explain the difference in legal terms, the difference between the state of emergency and the situation of emergency as it is? Thank you.
I would say that this is due to the different legal traditions. The best known country which does not provide anything for emergency situations is the United States. If you recall, in the Second World War, they faced it, of course, with the major emergency measures taken ad hoc. That was also the time with Franklin Roosevelt after the Great Depression. And also, if I may say, that was the case with Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century during the American Civil War. There are at least, we have enumerated them in our opinions, at least 8 European countries, member states of the Council of Europe, not the least, which do not provide in their constitutions for emergency situations. Belgium, Italy, Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. I would say that the rather new constitutions, especially in the eastern part of our continent, and in Greece, following a very tough dictatorship, do provide for those situations in order, let's say, to avoid or to try to have a grip on those situations. I would say that the question is not a question of formality. The question is the problem of if those steps are foreseen in due time, and at the same time, if there is enough flexibility which would allow the executive, which plays a very important role in those situations, to cope with unprecedented situations. However, as I do believe that Madam Commissioner insisted, we cannot have an unfettered executive. We need to have a parliamentary oversight and at the same time judicial oversight as well. And that's the big difficulty. I must confess, I was impressed by the French judicial reaction. The Conseil d'État has issued interim measures in Paris, 5 or 6 judgments in the last few weeks on coronavirus. And I'm trying to figure out which are the main lines. In fact, they trust the executive, but still, they have a very, very close eye on what the executive is deciding.
It's very interesting, the French experience, and actually you somehow shifted to another question I would like just to ask to you.
If I may mention one more example, I was impressed, I don't know if you have noticed it, Madam Commissioner, I was impressed by a Kosovo decision which provided that, I mean, very, very impressed by the self-reserve of the judges, which said that measure, a specific measure, is illegal, but the legality will run from a date to come, so it gave the time to the executive to correct the illegality. It was very, very cleverly done by Kosovarian judges.
So the state of emergency generally, as you mentioned, gives additional authorities to the government and introduces special procedures for making laws. Can the government exercise unlimited powers? What should be the role of other branches of government, namely parliament and the judiciary? Can the government suppress the activities of journalists, political activists, and civil society?
Yes.
What's your opinion on this issue? The role of governments in states of emergency.
We have dealt with those issues. The Commission has dealt with those issues in its various opinions. The basic issue is, of course, and I think the Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly has underlined it at least in 2 or 3 recommendations, the temporariness of the measures, short in duration. I would prefer, I must confess, sunset clauses in the various in the transfer of the various powers. The parliamentary oversight, though, might be difficult because, as we have seen with the current pandemic, people cannot and must not meet so many people in a special assembly. So I would say that electronic participation has to be introduced in the work of parliaments, and this is a new element, I would say, to my knowledge at least. Please correct me if I'm wrong. This is the new element in how parliaments operate, but even if you have to have a quorum of those present, you have to invent some devices so that not all members of parliament come together in a specific meeting, because that might be dangerous for their own health. So what we have done in Greece is rotation. There are very few parliamentarians who are asked to participate live in the various meetings. We have seen some pictures from the House of Commons in London. They are sitting, far away from each other, and other members are invited to participate electronically if they so wish. So these are completely new issues that have been invented during the current crisis, and I believe that only under the pressure of a crisis such kind of very important steps can be adopted. As far as the judiciary is concerned, I would say that it is not so obvious that electronic participation can substitute the hearing of a court, especially whenever the issues at stake are delicate and important. The electronic hearings may be fit for, not important, banal day-to-day issues. But whenever, measures, tough measures are at stake and contested by, human rights activists for whatever reasons. We have had that kind of issues in Greece, especially in regard to Roma, status of the Roma in Greece and status of immigrants as well. These issues are to be dealt by courts, and I would say that public hearings at court are absolutely necessary, especially interim measures that can be taken by courts. I don't know if you have an experience from other European countries, apart from Kosovo, France, and I would say there is also a judgment, to my knowledge, issued by the German Constitutional Court as well, as far as swimming is concerned. But on those very delicate issues of some protected minorities, which are the crucial issues, in fact, under the pandemic, I'm not aware that something really new occurred in the courts throughout Europe.
You already raised an issue of temporariness of the measures adopted, actually, and that's why I would like ask the last question. How can we make sure that the special regime of the state of emergency doesn't last longer than the emergency itself? How can we ensure that the constitution, the ordinary law, and the institutions of the state return to normal, and when they will return to normal?
Look, if it were possible that the Venice Commission drafts the constitution, the emergency clauses of the various constitutions, which is of course an utopia, I would say that the best solution would have been to include sunset clauses, that especially the transfer of powers to the executive, which is, a common topic everywhere, is not indefinite in time, but for a specific period of time, and may not be extended unless Parliament gives its approval. However, there are very delicate issues there. Are you going to involve also the opposition and provide for a qualified majority, at least for the extension of the measures of the emergency period, or not? I'm afraid that these are very subtle issues, and in any case, I do believe that it is a common acquis of the European, let's say, approach on those issues, that you shouldn't trust the executive on the length of of the emergency period, because any executive in any country would have the tendency to extend as long as possible, because it is an easy way to face various problems. So let us try to involve Parliament based on sunset clauses as much as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Alivizatos. I would like just to ask Mr. Cilevics and other colleagues, do you have any follow-up question to Mr. Alivizatos?
Yeah.
If not, so I would like just once again, on behalf of all of us, to express the words of gratitude to all of you, to the Secretariat, to the Commissioner, to our colleagues from the Venice Commission. And I would like just also to remind you that we will continue our webinar on the impacts of the COVID-19 on human rights and the rule of law with Mr. Nicos Alivizatos, President of the Committee on the Prevention of Torture, Ms. Alessandra Pieruccini, Chairperson of the Convention 108 Consultative Committee, and Mr. George Stava, Member of the European Committee for the Efficiency of Justice. Thank you everybody for participation. Thank you for joining this initiative, and thank you for being with us.